Okay. Okay, everybody. Well, welcome to our last talk of the year. It's my pleasure to introduce retired Brigadier General Jack R. Fox, who served as Cabinet Secretary of the New Mexico Department of Veteran Services from 2015 until 2018. Prior to this appointment, he served with the Army, Army Reserves, and New Mexico National Guard. General Fox is a graduate of the New Mexico Military Institute and New Mexico State University. Upon graduating with a Bachelor of Arts degree in government from NMSU, he was commissioned as a U.S. Army Second Lieutenant Infantry in 1969. While stationed at Fort Benning, Georgia, he earned a master's degree in education from Georgia State University. He is also a member of the New Mexico Military Institute Hall of Fame and the New Mexico State University ROTC Honor Company. He also served as Commandant of the New Mexico Military Institute and was President of St. John's Military School. He has also served on and was President of he also served on the New Mexico State Armory Board and the New Mexico National Guard Bataan Memorial Museum Foundation. In addition to all that, General Fox taught high school at Hereford High School in Texas and was selected as the Teacher of the Year in 1999. And he's a lifelong member of the VFW and Vietnam Veterans of America. And with all that, I'm really happy that he's spending some time with us out of his schedule to join us and talk about the Roughriders in New Mexico. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's really a pleasure for me to be here with you this evening and talk about a very important phase of New Mexico history. And the Roughriders rode into glory with Theodore Roosevelt, but they also were very prominent in making a difference for us as a state and becoming part of the Union. I want to give a shameless plug to New Mexico State Army ROTC, because last Friday we celebrated the 120th anniversary of ROTC at New Mexico State University. And as a proud Aggie, I'm very proud of that and what New Mexico State has done to provide leaders for our nation and in the service to our military. What I'd like to do tonight, I'm going to kind of set the stage. And again, we're kind of working after what I was just saying. I haven't really talked about this since COVID. So we're all coming out of COVID, but Roughriders is something that really fascinates me. And years ago, when I was on the museum board for the National Guard in Santa Fe, we got a call one day, would somebody talk about the Roughriders? They wanted somebody who would talk for free. There were a lot of people that would talk about the Roughriders if you'd pay them. And I said, yeah, I'll talk a little bit about it. I've always been a Rough Rider fan and Theodore Roosevelt fan. So I kind of got into this. So what I'm doing tonight is going to give you some of the research and some of the stuff that I looked at over a period of time looking at our Roughriders. I want to set the stage though about, okay. That was, any questions? I appreciate the opportunity to talk to everybody tonight.
We've got the laptop too high and they can only see your eyes up.
Oh,
how's that, Dennis?
well, I can, however you want me to do this.
No, it's fine. It was you that they couldn't see. It's not the.
Nobody needs to see me.
Go for it.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, I want to set the stage. I want to go back a little bit about where we are and why the Roughriders perhaps made such an impact on us as a state. Let's go back in 1846. We know New Mexico was part of Mexico in the Mexican War, and General Kearny comes down from Fort Leavenworth and goes to Las Vegas, New Mexico, and claims New Mexico for the United States. And then here in Las Cruces, in the southern part of New Mexico and Arizona, a few years later, you had the Gadsden Purchase, and we know we have what we recognize today as this New Mexico, state of New Mexico and New Mexico Territory. Well, this is all well and good. And then in the 1860s, the Civil War starts and the Union is torn apart and the soldiers leave the West, some of them leave the West, and New Mexico, northern part of New Mexico anyway, was basically pro-Union. There were Southern sympathizers down here in the southern part of the state, but basically we were pro-Union in northern New Mexico. And so General Sibley in Texas. He goes to Jefferson Davis, and I'm giving you the Reader's Digest very quick version. Basically says, allow me to invade New Mexico, go up to Colorado, take the silver mines, and we'll split the West off. California can't come through and help the East Coast, and everything will be good. Well, the governor of New Mexico, the Texans are coming up, and he asked for volunteers, and Kit Carson and Raphael Chacon and some other leaders went out and tried to recruit soldiers for the New Mexico militia to help the federal forces stop the Confederate advance. Well, they were going out and recruiting young men and people that had been basically Mexican citizens just a few years prior, and they're going out but this is true. They're trying to say, we're going to recruit for the Union. What's a union? Well, we don't really know what a union is. Yeah, we don't have any money. We don't have anything. We're going to, fight against slavery. We don't know what slaves are. We're going to fight the Texans. Well, sign me up. All you had to do was say, we're going to fight Texans. And it was pretty simple. Well, the New Mexico militia, they come down at Valverde, and it's just north of here. And I think most of you is interested in history are very much aware of the Battle of Valverde and what would happen. Well, the New Mexico volunteers are ordered to do a river crossing, and there's a lot of confusion. And first of all, if any of you have been soldiers and just trying to, you imagine what it's like to do a river crossing under fire under the best of circumstances, and there's no good circumstances when you're getting shot at. There was confusion. Also, part of the confusion was that the soldiers didn't understand the orders that were being given in English. So there was a great deal of confusion. The Union withdraws from the battlefield. It's considered a Confederate victory. And a lot of the blame was placed on the New Mexicans. And that will haunt us as a territory for several years. Again, the soldiers didn't understand the orders that were being given to them. There was a lot of confusion. They were poorly trained. But everybody needs a scapegoat. When you lose, you got to have a scapegoat. And the men from New Mexico were great, recipients of that disdain from the Union. Not to mention that, we go up to Glorieta, and Colorado volunteers come down, and it was a New Mexican that led the assault on the Apache Canyon and destroyed the Confederate supply lines. And New Mexico was saved for the Union. Well, all that's well and good. And through the period of time as we're growing as a territory, we are trying to become a state. Several attempts were made, but there was a disdain in the press on the East Coast about New Mexico. And we had some, our most famous New Mexican is Billy the Kid, a teenage killer. And that didn't play well with a lot of people. So things are happening, and New Mexico is trying to become a state. And then we are getting the background where we come to this point of the Spanish-American War. The United States had a long fascination with Cuba, and go back sitting a little more of the stage. In fact, in 1848, we offered to buy Cuba from Spain, and Spain declined the offer. But we tried this, and then building into this, and then the Spanish were very cruel to the Cuban people. And there was a lot of things going on. We would call them atrocities today. I wasn't there, but I'm sure that the media and the press was right. But this was also a time when journalism papers are selling big in the United States. And I'm sure you've heard the name Pulitzer and Hearst. They owned a couple of the major newspapers, and it was an age we called yellow journalism. And they were competing. And one of the ways they would sell these newspapers, the social media of the day, was that they would create stories. Some of them were based on fact, but the sensationalism. And I've got something coming up here, Dennis Daly. I don't know what that is. Push that up there. Okay, all right. Well, I'm not technically proficient, so but anyway, I hope you get the feel. So the public, we've gone to the West Coast. We've settled all the lands that are to be settled. The United States is looking, the media, the American people are looking, other countries are establishing empires, and here we are. But we're looking at Cuba and the atrocities going on in Cuba and the things that are going on in Cuba, and the newspapers creating stories, and the American public is getting aroused in this sensationalism. And every story, they're trying to top another story about what's going on. And so there was this tension building in the United States towards Spain, and again, towards Cuba and Puerto Rico and the Spanish territories. And there was a guy in that's also picked up that I wanted to interject here right now, Theodore Roosevelt. You can't separate the story of the Rough Riders from Theodore Roosevelt. And Theodore Roosevelt, I think any of you, if you've studied him, he will rank as, in whatever poll you want to look at, Roosevelt will eventually be ranked as one of the top 5 presidents in US history. He was definitely a change maker in the history of the United States, but he started out as a son of in New York, and his father didn't go to the Civil War, and that would constantly bother Theodore Roosevelt. And he admired his father, but in the back of his mind, his dad didn't go fight. And Theodore Roosevelt was raised this rugged life. He became quite an athlete, and he made himself along the way. And he gets married. He's in the New York legislature, and his wife and mother die on the same day, and he escapes to the American West. And he goes to North Dakota, Madera, North Dakota, becomes a rancher, and he becomes a cowboy, and he becomes fascinated with this rugged way of life. And he has a great deal of respect for the men and women that settled the Western United States. And he would go back and he would get into politics, and he'd move up, and eventually police commissioner in New York City. If you've ever watched Blue Bloods and Tom Selleck's office, there's a picture of Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt was a police commissioner in New York City. Then he gets appointed Assistant Secretary of the Navy. And this is where his story really takes off. John Long, who was the Secretary of Navy, takes off one summer, and they think Theodore Roosevelt's going to be harmless. Well, Theodore Roosevelt is one of these people wanting to go to war with Spain. And he thinks that war is an answer for manhood. It's a way we need to go as a nation. We need to establish ourselves. And he sends out the fleet. The secretary's gone, and he starts stockpiling ammunition and supplies in the Pacific to go to war with Spain. And this will prove very beneficial as we go along the way. He's also a friend of a guy named Leonard Wood. And Leonard Wood received the Medal of Honor in service against the Apaches in the southwestern United States. He's also a surgeon, and he's a surgeon to President McKinley, President of the United States. Leonard Wood and Roosevelt become fast friends. And they start talking about the future of a war with Spain. And they crack this idea about, man, if we could organize a group of volunteers from the Western United States, if we could get these cowboys and farmers and ranchers and Indians, and we could get these men of the Southwest, we don't have to train them. They'll be ready to go fight right away. Well, they start talking this, and it becomes, and Leonard Wood has the ear of President McKinley. Now, McKinley, through all the talk of going to war, McKinley is a Civil War veteran, President McKinley, and he had seen the bloodshed, and he's recorded as saying, "I never want to see another American boy die." So McKinley, unlike some of the presidents we had, he was really anti-war, but the Congress of the United States, the American people, are pushing for war. And in 1898, January of 1898, the battleship Maine goes to Havana Harbor, and it blows up. And immediately the press, the media, Spain blew up the ship. And it will be over 100 years later that we find out that it was a boiler explosion. It was not the Spanish, but that didn't matter to the American public at the time. Don't confuse facts with what we want to believe. And the war fever was there. And so the American people remember the Maine. We've got to go to war. We've got to do what we can to salvage our honor. President McKinley couldn't prevent it. And the things get away from him. And so he declares war April 22nd, 1898. See if I can get this. Okay. I'm kind of frozen here. I'll get my technical support team here.
It's cranky sometimes, I think. Try that.
Okay, we'll try. All right, I'm sure most of you have seen this picture, and that's kind of setting the stage for the Rough Riders, and this is where we're going to go from this point on. This is actually Roosevelt and the New Mexico Volunteers and the 9th and 10th Cavalry on top of Kettle Hill. Very famous photograph. Okay, when the war starts, there's only 27,000 soldiers in the American Army. The president has to call up the National Guard. The National Guard was obviously in the states that existed. It's the National Guard, similar to what we know today. They'd been trained. And so he's activating the Guard units because Spain outnumbers us dramatically in soldiers. So he has to have the Guard. In the meantime, the president has been convinced by Leonard Wood and Theodore Roosevelt to call for volunteers from New Mexico, Arizona, Indian Territory, and Oklahoma. These are the 4 territories. And it's pretty easy to ask for volunteers from the territories. And so the call goes out. Governor Otero, governor of New Mexico, then is notified, and he activates 4 troops of what we call our New Mexico National Guard today, E, F, G, and H, along with the other volunteers. And so the call has gone out in New Mexico. The leaders we'll talk about in a minute are calling for volunteers nationwide. And this is not social media we know today. Nationwide, within about 24 hours, over 2,300 people had volunteered to join the Roughriders. Now, Roosevelt is initially offered command of the Roughriders. And for all the things you can think about Theodore Roosevelt, he was a very smart man, and he knew what he didn't know. And he didn't know how to organize, and he didn't know how to train. Though he had been in the New York National Guard, but he didn't really know how to do this. And so he advocated for Leonard Wood to be the commander, and he would be the deputy, and he would learn. And that's one of the things I have to give Theodore Roosevelt credit for. He could have easily, because he's one of the most famous men in the United States at this time, taken command. But he wanted to be a soldier, and he wanted to go to war. He resigns as Assistant Secretary of the Navy. And there's a lot of people very, very upset with him for doing this. The New Mexico volunteers that flock to volunteers, it's like New Mexicans always do. We're one of the states with the highest percentage of men and women to go volunteer to serve. And the volunteers come from all the cities you see here: Albuquerque, Santa Fe, Las Vegas, Cerrillos, Roswell, Tularosa, Las Cruces. And they flock to join the call. Some of the key New Mexico figures that will go: General Henry Hershey was the adjutant general in New Mexico. And a lot of people don't realize the adjutant general's job of an adjutant general in any state or any territory is to organize the militia and to stay behind if the Guard is called up, to stay behind and help the governor organize future militias. So General Hershey resigns as adjutant general so he can go join the Roughriders. James Massey and James Brody from Santa Fe, medical staff, they will become very important. E Troop is commanded by Frederick Mueller of Santa Fe, F Troop by Maximiano Luna of Las Vegas, G Troop by William Henry Harrison Llewellyn of Las Cruces. I never knew what the HH stood for, and so I'm very proud of that, getting that out. George Curry of Tularosa, and then obviously Roosevelt and Leonard Wood. Now, Governor Otero had some problems. Now, this is where this plays in. Because of the reputation of our Hispanic soldiers, through no fault of their own during the Civil War, there is a feeling that we can't really trust New Mexicans, and we can't trust, quote, the Mexicans in New Mexico to go to war. So Governor Otero, he's very conscious of this, and he wants to make sure that the men he sends from New Mexico represent the finest of New Mexico. He wants them to give credit to the state of New Mexico, or the territory of New Mexico, when they go to war. And so he doesn't call for many Hispanic volunteers. In fact, I think there's only 6 or 7. 2 of them, the Britos from this area. One of your historical publications had an article about Frank and Jose Brito. They're asked to go because they could speak English. Maximiano Luna was in the legislature. He had been a sheriff of Valencia County. He's a very prominent, comes from a very prominent New Mexico family. He had been educated back east. He's articulate, he's a leader, and Governor Otero tasked him and gives him command of one of the troops. Frederick Miller was given another command. There's some politics being played here. There's a lot going on, so you got to make sure you have the right mix of Democrats and Republicans when you go to war, because you want everybody united. And then George Curry was from Tularosa. Now, Curry and Llewellyn, they had actually been sheriffs, and along with Maximia, but they had been Indian fighters. They had reputations. They had reputations throughout the southwestern United States. So Otero did a good job in picking his leaders. The regiment is formed. They go to Santa Fe. They're sworn into duty, and then they get ready to depart. Leonard Wood goes to San Antonio, and this is part of the strategy they devised. Leonard Wood goes down to San Antonio in May to receive the volunteers coming in to form the first volunteer cavalry regiment. Theodore Roosevelt stays in DC for about a week because Theodore Roosevelt has the connections in Washington, DC. He knows the people in what we call the Pentagon of that era. He knows the people in the War Department. And he and Leonard Wood want to make sure that they get the Craig rifles, which the active army is using. They want to get the uniforms of the active army. They don't want to be left with the weapons that the National Guard has. And this is critical. This plays an important part. Plus, Theodore Roosevelt has all the connections and he has all the, quote, media attention of the day. And so everybody is going to be drawn to Theodore Roosevelt. Nobody wants to argue with Theodore Roosevelt. As one of his secretaries of state later, Theodore Roosevelt was like a 6-year-old kid on Christmas. He was full of energy. He was high energy. He's like a steam locomotive running out of control. And Roosevelt was just a force of nature. That's who he was, and he would always be. But he's very active in getting the equipment and supplies for the Roughriders. In the meantime, Wood is in San Antonio receiving the troops. And they're going to focus on training. And they've got a short period of time to get the training done. Now, one of the things that happened that I think is a credit to Theodore Roosevelt, he was very popular. He was from Harvard and the people back in Princeton and Yale and all of these people back east, they want to be part of the Roughriders. And in fact, there's all kinds of names floating around, Woods, Weary Walkers, and there was all kinds of names like that being thrown around. But the focus is on Theodore Roosevelt, basically more than Leonard Wood. And all these Ivy Leaguers and these people back east, they want to be part of this unit. They want to go to war. There's this energy and excitement. The United States hadn't really been in a war since the Civil War. And these young men think this is what they need to do. Well, Roosevelt is very selective. And he realized this could overwhelm what he wants to build is this unit of men from the Southwestern United States, from the West, these farmers and ranchers and these cowboys. And so he's very selective on who he lets in. And one of the things he tells these Ivy Leaguers when they get to San Antonio, this is a quote, unless you're willing to peel potatoes with a boy from New Mexico, you can't be in this unit. He was very protective of these men. And they will come together and they will gel. Somehow under the leadership of Wood and Theodore Roosevelt, these men come together in a very short order. They accomplish this great mission. They have to buy horses. They go out and they buy over 1,000 horses. Remember, this is going to be a cavalry troop. This is the vision, the first volunteer cavalry regiment. And so they're buying these horses and they're bringing them into camp. And this is where the New Mexicans and the Arizonans and the Oklahomans, they're breaking the horses. And it's a great sport. And people from San Antonio, they come and watch this and they're just, all of these trying to blend this mixture of what I call pure Americana of that time together, and they're forming this cavalry unit. And they somehow gel. And Roosevelt's learning a lot too. Some great stories about the Roughriders, these cowboys. There was a guy named McGinney, and he was very bow-legged and he couldn't march. But they loved him and he was very short. And so McGinney would say, if you let me ride a horse, I can stay in step. And stuff like that. And so one night, Roosevelt and Hall, who's the adjutant, are going around inspecting guards. They're training the men, they're doing guard duty. And they come up on this one cowboy and he's on guard duty. And the young man, in the military, there's a certain protocol for when you're on guard and how you're supposed, halt, who goes there. And the young man says, hey, how y'all doing this evening? It didn't go over well with the adjutant. And the adjutant says, that's not the way you act. And you're supposed to bring that rifle up. And the young man says, hell, sir, it ain't even loaded. That's the cowboys. That's the men from the West. But they're bringing them together. One day Roosevelt, and they're doing a lot of training and drills on horseback. They get the horses trained. And Theodore Roosevelt, and all the energy and excitement he has, and he runs off and they're doing a drill and they're running around on the horseback. And he's so proud of the men, and they come in and there's a beer tent and he buys everybody beer. Well, Leonard Wood finds out. Now, Leonard Wood was regular Army, and he calls Lieutenant Colonel Roosevelt in. And I can imagine this conversation, but basically I've been on the receiving end of these kind of talks. And, he says, you don't do that. And that was dumb. And Roosevelt meekly says, now this is probably the most famous man in America at that time, other than the president. And he says, I'm the dumbest man here. And sir, it'll never happen again. And Theodore Roosevelt is learning how to be a leader, and he's learning how to mix with the men. And the great chemistry that happens is because of that leadership, these men come together. Then now this is, I lied, no discipline problems. There were some desertions. And when I talk about discipline, there would be some discipline, but it didn't result in court martials or anything later, and because Theodore Roosevelt wouldn't do that. They get the orders to go to Tampa. So they load the troops, they load the horses, and and the Army was totally disorganized at this time. They weren't ready to go to war. They weren't ready to do this movement of troops from San Antonio to Tampa. And it's taking quite a while, and they get the trains, and then they have to get the soldiers, they have to get the food, and they start moving. They move throughout the southern United States. And remember, just a few years earlier, we'd had the Civil War. And one of the things that's happening is this excitement of the Roosevelts and the Rough Riders going to Tampa, is this feeling of energy, and Confederates are coming out, and widows are coming out, and they're giving the men food, and we're coming together as a nation. And we needed something like this. In fact, two Civil War generals, Shafter and Wheeler, Wheeler is a Confederate, will be put in charge of the cavalry, because they're trying to bring the nation together out of this. They go to Tampa, and it's totally disorganized. George Curry, Wood, and Roosevelt go into Tampa. Tampa wasn't ready for the influx of troops. The sand, the dirt, there's total disorganization. And they leave George Curry to unload the horses. And Curry's getting frustrated, he can't get anything. So Curry finally breaks all the rules, commandeers the train, gets the horses off, and gets into camp. And he's very late, and he's violated all the rules. And he goes to Roosevelt, and he reports in, and Roosevelt says, and he apologizes. He said, "I did all this wrong." And Roosevelt says, "I can't believe it took you this long." They're trying to go to war. There's an excitement. They want to go to war. And the media is all over everything because of Theodore Roosevelt. The experience in Tampa was not like San Antonio. It was very miserable for the Rough Riders. They want to get out of there. And so did all the other soldiers. They get the order to sail, and there's an excitement everywhere. Well, they get their ship. They're going to be, one of the things that happens that's very bad, though, is they're going to be horse cavalry. Guess what they get told? We can't take the horses. The Army finally woke up. Cuba is not a place in the jungle for horse cavalry maneuver. And so you can't take your horses. Oh, and by the way, we can't take all the soldiers on the first lift. So you've got to leave some men of the Rough Riders behind. This is emotional. This is emotional to these men. They're leaving the horses, and yet some of their brothers have to stay behind. And George Curry and Maximiano Luna, they're going to have to leave one of the troops from New Mexico. And it's very rough for Roosevelt and Wood, because Luna wants to go for all the right reasons. He feels like he's got to prove that New Mexicans, and especially Mexicans of Hispanic descent, are as good as anybody else. It's important to him. Curry wants to go, and they flip a coin. And Luna, his troop, gets to go. Curry will stay behind, and Major Hershey from New Mexico, the adjutant general, former adjutant general, will stay behind in Tampa, and they think they're going to get to come later. And they basically become an MP detachment, and they stay behind. There's confusion at the docks. Leonard Wood and Roosevelt go down. They try to find the name of their ship. They're told they're going to go into Yucatan. Leonard Wood, and they know that two other Army units, a National Guard unit and Army unit, both bigger than the Rough Riders, are going to try to board the ship, and there's not enough room for everybody. Leonard Wood actually goes out and gets the ship, and he sends Roosevelt to get the troops back. Roosevelt hurries. They double quick back. He commandeers a coal train and makes it back up 9 miles to the dock, and they unload, and they barely get the Rough Riders on before the other two units show up. And there's a great deal of cussing and shouting and screaming because everybody wants to go to war. And basically, the Rough Riders were on, and Roosevelt and Wood said, we win, you lose, and this is the way it is. But there was a lot of emotion, and it's totally confusion. And I don't know how to explain this other than just imagine your worst chaotic day in your life. You've got about 1,500 kindergartners running around, you're trying to get organization. That's what I would equate, or herding cats. That's the way it was at Tampa. And the Army, nobody knows what's going on. It's totally disorganized. But they get on the ship, and then they can't leave right away because of I'm getting more stuff in I keep doing something here. Okay, I got it. Okay, let's go back. All right. They get on the ship, then they can't go right away because there's a rumor the Spanish fleet is off the coast. So the men are stuck on the ship. The rations are terrible. There's very little ice. But the morale is still high because they're going to go to war. And they finally sail and they take off to Cuba. And they don't know where they're going to go around until they go around Havana Bay and they realize that they're actually going to get to make the landing. I want to back up a minute. Again, I want to go back to the Navy. And this is very important because, you know, the Spanish fleet is hemmed up in Havana Bay, but in the Philippines, Admiral Dewey, and I'm sure most of you have heard of Admiral Dewey, damn the torpedoes full speed ahead. Dewey became a national hero because on the 1st of May, he destroyed the Spanish fleet in the Philippines and Manila Harbor. And so, you know, the Army wants to get on the action now. And you know, they don't want the Navy getting all the glory. You know, they're still in the 1890s, there's still inter-service rivalry. There still is, yes, by the way, yeah. Go Army. Okay, all right. Yeah. Shameless plug there. But they're stuck on the ship, but the morale remains high. They train, they do everything they can. The officers are studying how to be officers. And basically, they're very, very well trained. Now I'm going to walk over here and just try to yell. And so they will actually come over to Daiquiri, I'll talk about in a minute, and then they will move to Siboney, and then they will move up to what we will know as the Battle of San Juan Hill and Kep Heights. So this is the map. So the American Army is landing in Daiquiri, and that's where the Roughriders will go up. There are no landing craft to take them. This is basically an old rum distillery area. Like everything else that's going on in this war, nothing was prepared, nothing was planned. The Army actually has been told that Cuban insurgents are going to be there and help with the landing. There's no Cuban insurgents there. If the Cuban Army would have just tried to defend that, we wouldn't have landed. But the Spanish Army, rather, the Spanish Army was as disorganized at this point, I think we were. We try to unload everything. The horses and mules are basically just thrown overboard, and with the hope that they will swim to shore. And the mules were for supply. Leonard Wood, some of the officers, and Roosevelt had horses. Roosevelt had 2 horses, and one of them was Rain in the Face, and one of them Little Texas. Little Texas will be the one you see on all the pictures of Theodore Roosevelt. Rain in the Face, they throw him off the ship, and he swims out the ocean and drowns. Nobody told the horses which way the land was. They just assumed. And so they're, you know, this is emotional. Again, these are cowboys. These are men of the West. They were going to be cavalry, and they're watching their animals be killed. The troops land at Daiquiri. They load in very small little boats. The 6,000 men are landed, which is a miracle, very quickly. Only one of the boats capsizes. It was one of the African-American troops, and their soldiers totally loaded with their equipment. And they drown. Bucky O'Neill, who's a famous Arizonan, one of the Roughriders, he dives in the water, he tries to save them, and he can't pull them up. But it's a miracle that only 2 people lost their lives in all the confusion of this landing. Battle of Guasimas, I will come back to this one in a minute, if I can do this. So one of the things they did, they're brigaded with the regular army. Again, Roosevelt and Wood are blessed by a couple of things, and one of it's just luck. But now we've heard of embedded reporters. Every newspaper man in the country wanted to be with the Roughriders. So they had their built-in press agents. They had Richard Harding Davids. They had Jack London would eventually catch up with them, Frederick Remington. All of these famous reporters are there, and they're covering, they want to be with the Roughriders. They're not really interested in the regular army. The Roughriders is where it's at. That's capture the spirit of the American people. So they're given orders. They move up to Siboney. I showed you on the map a while ago, and they bivouac. And then they're given the orders to move on June 24th. Let's see if I can get this back here. So if you look, the main attack is supposed to be along this route. This is the Roughriders on the hilly region. The Roughriders have the harder terrain. And again, they're moving they're not really good at marching. They were cavalrymen. So they're struggling along. It's hot, it's heat, the intense, and they're moving up along that ridge line. And then they start hearing the guns. They start hearing the firing. The regulars are open fire. The Rough Riders can hear it. L Troop, which had Captain Capron, who was one of the most famous American soldiers, and Hamilton Fish. And I go back to these Ivy Leaguers. Hamilton Fish was one of the most famous athletes in the United States at that time. He was from the Ivy League schools. He was famous. He had a lot of media, and he just wants to be a sergeant. And he and his captain are leading L Troop, and they're advancing. They're kind of like a skirmishing line moving to contact, and then they take fire from the enemy. And then everything breaks loose. The Spanish are using smokeless powders. The Rough Riders cannot see where the Spanish are shooting from. And finally, Richard Harding Davis, who's a reporter, who's with Roosevelt, he sees some Spanish hats and he points them out to Theodore Roosevelt. And then they start moving. And one of the reporters says that, Roosevelt is all this movement and excitement and everything. And he said it was almost like a physical image. Roosevelt crosses this fence and there's like a magical transformation. Theodore Roosevelt becomes a warrior. He goes from this guy that wants to be a warrior. And when he crossed that fence and they're moving up to Guasimas, he becomes a warrior and he's leading his men. And that transformation is very important. They move on, they start shooting at the enemy. Roosevelt is with Llewellyn from Las Cruces. They're very good friends, and he happens to be moving with them, and he's coordinating part of the movement, and Leonard Wood's moving some of the other Rough Riders. And they move up and they see the buildings up ahead of them, the Spanish. Roosevelt grabs a rifle and he starts shooting. And the soldiers are like, you're really supposed to be leading us. You're not supposed to be fighting, but Roosevelt's caught up in it. The warrior in him takes charge. Eventually, the Spanish retreat. General Wheeler, who was the Confederate cavalry officer, is heard when he sees the Spanish leaving. We have the damn Yankees on the run. So he had a flashback to the Civil War. After that, Roosevelt consolidates. They get a rumor when this is going on that Leonard Wood has been killed, and everybody's shaken up. Well, he hadn't been killed. He was delayed in part of the fighting, and they find him, and so this is very good. General Young, who was their brigade commander, and Leonard Wood was regimental commander, becomes ill, and Leonard Wood is promoted to become the brigade commander. Theodore Roosevelt becomes Colonel Theodore Roosevelt, commander of the Rough Riders. So he has his unit. He's dedicated to his men. He's dedicated to taking care of them. The supplies are inadequate. The story is told Roosevelt goes down to draw supplies and he wants beans. And the supply master tells him, beans are only for the officers. And Roosevelt says, well, I have 580 officers. And that was Theodore Roosevelt. He cares about his men. He's continually looks after wounded. They were shaken up. 8 Rough Riders were killed. This was their first engagement. Eight Rough Riders were killed. And the shock weighs in on these men. They realize this isn't a game, but their morale is high. This is the real world. And the stories told of the vultures and the Spanish land crabs tearing the bodies apart. And it's just pretty hard to take in all of this, but they're focused on their mission. They're focused on what they do. On June 30th, the Rough Riders are alerted to move and make an attack, a supporting attack of the main army as they're moving towards El Caney. Let's see if I can go back to that. This is a crowded map. I'm just going to tell you that this is Kevin Hill and this is San Juan Hill. The Rough Riders are the supporting attack. The main army is going towards San Juan Hill. And the Rough Riders are in another support mission. Roosevelt and Wood are together briefly. Spanish are shelling. 2 of the men around him are killed instantly. Roosevelt's wounded in the wrist. Leonard Wood's horse is shot out from underneath him. So they're taking intense fire. Wood tells Roosevelt to move the Rough Riders and move on down to another position and wait for orders to attack. It's exhausting. Theodore Roosevelt has one of his aides shot and killed. Another guy, comes up and is shot. I mean, this is the intense combat's going on, all of this. So they're moving in position. Roosevelt wants to get the order to move his troops, and he finally gets the order. He's going to lead his men into combat. He's on horseback, and you've seen the pictures, and I showed you the one at the start. Roosevelt really did ride Little Texas, and he starts at the rear of the unit. He's got him in a skirmish line. They're moving forward, and he's trying to give orders, and he's moving up, and he realizes he can't really lead the men. So he rides his horse to the front of the formation, and he's leading the men in the attack, and they're getting shot. Roosevelt comes by one of the soldiers who's laying on the ground scared, and Roosevelt looks at him and said, "Look at me, I'm on horseback. You need to stand up." And the guy is shot and killed. So Roosevelt's in the thick of all this fighting that's going on, but they're moving on up, and they're going up the hill. As they're going up, the 10th Cavalry is moving up the hill. One of the color bearers, the color bearer was shot, and the color bearer, he picks up the flag, and he's yelling out to white and black soldiers, "Rally on the colors, rally on the colors." And they're charging up the hill. One of the reporters says, you see the American soldiers, and pretty soon you see a guy crumple and another guy crumple, and they'll fall, but they keep moving. They keep moving up the hill. Roosevelt moves through the lines, and he's moving up, and the regulars had been told to stay in position until they were given the order. Well, Roosevelt has already got the order, and he's taking his men on up the hill, and he has confrontation. There's a captain, command of one of the regular army units, and Roosevelt says, "Charge." And he says, the captain says, I'm not going to go until I'm given orders by the senior, my commander. Roosevelt, "Where's your colonel?" And he says, "I don't know." And Roosevelt says, "I'm the senior colonel here." Well, Roosevelt is a National Guard colonel. He's not an active Army colonel. So the guy's kind of hesitating. The Rough Riders said they kind of lose track of the battle right now, because Roosevelt is using some very profane language, dressing down this captain, basically say, "Then get the hell out of the way. We're going up the hill." And the other men start following, and there's a great deal of exuberance, and they're going up the hill. And again, the guys are getting shot, and the regulars follow. The units move forward. Roosevelt's on horseback. He finally comes to a fence line. He gets off. He and his aide are moving on up the hill because he can't ride Little Texas anymore. Two Spanish soldiers jump up in front of Bradishar, who is his aide. His aide shoots and kills one of them. They start to run. Two more Spanish soldiers jump up in front of Roosevelt. They shoot at him, and they start to run away. Roosevelt takes his pistol, and he misses the first one, but he kills the second. And as far as I know, other than a lot of American presidents went to war, but as far as I know, the only two presidents actually killed a man personally, and that was Andrew Jackson in a duel, and Theodore Roosevelt in combat. And Roosevelt, actually, that's how close they were to get somebody with a pistol. I don't know if some of you great pistol shots, but in the Army, the only danger I would pose to anybody if I could throw the pistol and hit him. I couldn't hit anybody. So Roosevelt, better pistol shot than I would be. The soldiers moving on up, Roosevelt's leading, and they going up, and the hill becomes Kettle Hill because there's these great big kettles on top of the hill. Troops E, F, and G from New Mexico are some of the first. They're famous photograph. You see the guidons from New Mexico. A great competition between the Army and the Rough Riders. Every unit that was in that charge claims that their guidons were the first on the hill. Roosevelt, they consolidate. He's the senior officer. He consolidates the position, and they notice that the Army is still moving up San Juan Hill. So this is Kettle Hill, where that charge Roosevelt was on horseback. Then they hear guns. They think it's Spanish guns. It's Gatling guns or U.S. Gatling guns. They're supporting the attack for the Army going up San Juan Hill. Roosevelt's on Kettle Hill. He's directing fire. He can see the Army moving up San Juan Hill, and he gives the order, and he says, "Let's charge." And he starts running, and he has to run down a hill to run up a hill. He's on Kettle Hill. He's got to run down to run up San Juan Hill. And he goes, and in the confusion, only 5 men are with him, and one of them gets shot. So Roosevelt's down there, and that's when he makes one of his bad mistakes, is he runs back up the hill, and he's chewing out the Rough Riders, and they're very embarrassed. "Colonel, we didn't hear the order." And then he charges them back down the hill, and they go up. They fan out on the crest of the hill. They join the Army soldiers up there, and they secure San Juan Hill. And they could see Santiago. And if the Army would have gone on right then, the war would have been over. For whatever reason, we have the momentum. The American infantry and cavalry are moving forward, and the Spanish are retreating. But the commanders, whatever reason, they stop it. Roosevelt consolidates, and you see the statistics right there. 1,071 men in the attack are killed or wounded, 375 from the cavalry, 89 Rough Riders. Rough Riders had the highest unit casualty rate of any unit. You know, it sounds like, but remember, you only have 500 men in the 490 men actually in the attack, and you have 85 wounded, so 89 wounded, so that's a pretty high casualty rate. Other than sniper fire, this basically ends the combat for the Rough Riders. Roosevelt focuses on his men. He would rotate men. He'd keep them on the front lines. They're in a static position until 17 July when Spain will surrender. He's always buying food for his men. He's taking care of his men. One of the things that Roosevelt and all the other commanders realize is that there's very little support. Men are dying of disease. Roosevelt writes a letter and doesn't get any favors from the Army. He's very critical of the Army's management of everything. So on August 6th, through Roosevelt and his influence, he gets the Rough Riders to call home. They go back to New York. The Rough Riders that were in Tampa join them, and they will go to New York, and they will eventually disband. There's a lot of media, a lot of press. When the unit is inactivated, the stories are there's not a dry eye in all the soldiers. Roosevelt shakes the hand of every Rough Rider. They give him a Frederick Remington bronze of the Bronco Buster. Very emotional for the men. I will say that the mascots of Arizona, they had a mountain lion, and New Mexicans had an eagle, and the mascots were very popular in New York. If you go in and look at the casualty list, 25 Rough Riders are killed and 104 wounded in the total of the engagement there. Heavy losses for a small regiment. The United States, again, but of those casualties, most of it would be disease. The war ends August 12th, 1898, and the Rough Riders are disbanded and they move into history. The Rough Riders probably singularly in the shortest period of time become one of the most famous units in the history of the United States military. Theodore Roosevelt was put in for the Medal of Honor, the Army, because he was very critical of the Army and he was a National Guardsman. He didn't get his Medal of Honor until 100 years later, when the Army realized that, and I hope you got the feeling from the actions I was talking about. I'm using Theodore, all those men were very brave, but Roosevelt, if you ever look at Medal of Honor, he was extremely courageous in leading his men into combat. Leonard Wood would go on, eventually become Chief of Staff of the Army. He's a Medal of Honor recipient. Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri is named after him. George Curry, H Troop, will become governor of the territory of New Mexico, will eventually go to the Philippines. He has a very distinguished career, a lot of history with George Curry. Maximiano Luna. Now I want to go back to the impact and why I was setting the stage for the Spanish soldiers. When Governor Otero had to pick leaders, he picked Maximiano Luna because he wanted someone that would represent the best of New Mexico. And Maximiano Luna could. He could translate, he was a good leader, and Luna was a great representative. And it's largely, and Theodore Roosevelt would come to respect the men from New Mexico, and Roosevelt would become an advocate for our statehood. And it's largely through the efforts of the Rough Riders and Luna and the Britos and the Oteros that were Rough Riders that the attitude towards New Mexico would change. And in 1912, we become a state. If it wasn't for those actions, it might have been a little longer before we become a state. So what Governor Otero did in selecting his men, he selected the right men to lead and represent New Mexico in this battle. Luna Community College is named after Maximiano. Luna County is not named after him, contrary, it's named after his father. I just throw that in there. But he's very famous. He was Speaker of the House of Representatives, and he's asked to go back, and he goes to the Philippines and he gives his life serving his country. Frederick Mueller, Land Office Register, he's one of our famous leaders. Lehigh, Troop G, district judge. Numa Fringer, district judge. These are all Rough Riders. Sergeant George Ormijo becomes state corporation commissioner. He has a child and he asked Roosevelt. Roosevelt, by then as president of the United States, said, I want you to be the godfather. Guess where Theodore Roosevelt goes? He goes to New Mexico for the christening. James Massey, a famous New Mexican, becomes our surgeon. Luna County, Roosevelt and Curry counties are named after two of the Rough Riders, not Luna County. That's an error. First Rough Rider reunion is held in Las Vegas, New Mexico in 1899. A lot of people say, why Las Vegas, New Mexico? Because the railroad went through and they had one of the largest hotels in the Western United States. There's there's cameras of Roosevelt. Roosevelt went to the Rough Rider reunion. I would say I had the fortune of go to the Rough Rider Museum in Las Vegas and look at the letters of the Rough Riders. And it's very interesting what they refer to Roosevelt. Roosevelt becomes president of the United States. He's very loyal to his Rough Riders, but every letter they call him the Colonel. He's not president. He's not Teddy. The respect those men had for him, he is the Colonel. New Mexico National Guard is the only, we have the Santiago campaign ribbon. It belongs to New Mexico, in our lineage, in New Mexico Guard. As a result of the actions of these men from New Mexico, our statehood was sped up. And the Rough Riders right into history. Roosevelt would be intensely loyal to the men of the Rough Riders. There was a story circulating in Washington, D.C. that you can be in prison and call Roosevelt, he'll make you sheriff of some county. That's the kind of loyalty and love they had. Llewellyn would go on and become Speaker of the House of Representatives too. These are just some sources. I was saying everything I've given you is from a multitude of books. These are just samples of some of the books that what I've given you on tonight. So that's New Mexico. That's the Rough Riders. That's our history as New Mexicans. We can claim the Rough Riders. Approximately 40% of the Rough Riders are from New Mexico, and that's part of our history. Several Rough Riders are buried in Fairfield Cemetery in Albuquerque, and it's pretty moving to go see their final resting place. That's it. Do I have any questions? I know that I think there's somebody may want to ask a question.
Great presentation.
Okay, well, that's your Rough Riders. Thank you.
As you can tell, I don't really care about the Rough Riders. Well, if you ever study Theodore Roosevelt, and you say, I wish every president had that. I'm not knocking any president, but I wish every president had that enthusiasm that he had when he was in office. Like I said,
Thank you for attending, everyone who tuned in via Zoom. Hope you enjoyed the presentation as much as I did here. And we will see
baby
you
at every christening,
hopefully in
black at
January.
every wedding, and a corpse at every funeral.
And
Thanks, everybody, for coming out.
Oh, okay.
relay more information to you. So thanks a lot for coming out. Good night.
Yeah.